In 1860, a woman named Elizabeth Packard was forcibly taken from her home in Illinois by her husband, Theophilus, and two doctors who declared her insane without ever conducting a formal examination, without allowing her to defend herself or to present evidence of her sanity, and without any legal process that would have given her rights to contest the commitment. Elizabeth was locked in the Illinois State Hospital for the Insane, where she would be held against her will for 3 years. Not because she was actually insane, but because she had disagreed with her minister husband about religious doctrine and had expressed opinions that he found embarrassing and that he believed threatened his authority as head of household. Under Illinois law in 1860, a husband had absolute authority to commit his wife to an asylum simply by claiming she was insane and by getting 2 doctors to sign a certificate agreeing with his assessment. And once committed, a wife had essentially no legal recourse to challenge her confinement or to prove her sanity, because married women were not considered legally competent to manage their own affairs or to contract lawyers or to file lawsuits without their husband's permission. Elizabeth's case would eventually expose how this legal framework was being systematically abused by husbands who wanted to silence disobedient wives, to steal wives' property, or to clear the way for remarriage. And her successful fight for release would spark a movement to reform commitment laws and to establish basic rights for married women. Before we descend into the nightmare of how marriage could become imprisonment and how the law enabled husbands to destroy wives who challenged their authority, hit that subscribe button right now, smash that notification bell, and drop your state in the comments below. This is Epoch of Fear, where we expose the legal horrors that trapped women for centuries. The legal doctrine of coverture, which governed marriage in the United States and Britain from medieval times through the 19th century, was based on the principle that husband and wife became one legal person upon marriage, and that person was the husband. This meant that married women lost virtually all legal rights and became completely subject to their husband's authority and control. A married woman could not own property in her own name, because any property she brought to the marriage or acquired during it became her husband's property automatically. She could not sign contracts because she had no legal capacity to create binding agreements. She could not sue or be sued because she had no standing in court as a separate legal entity. She could not control her own earnings because anything she earned belonged to her husband. She could not leave her husband's household without his permission, and if she did leave, he had legal authority to force her return. She had no right to custody of her children, because children belonged to the father under law. And critically, for understanding commitment abuse, she had no legal capacity to challenge decisions her husband made about her welfare, including decisions to confine her in an asylum, because the law presumed that husbands acted in their wives' best interests and gave wives no independent voice to contradict their husbands' judgments. The specific mechanisms for committing someone to an insane asylum in the mid-19th century varied by state, but generally involved minimal procedural protections and depended heavily on subjective judgments by doctors, who often had financial incentives to certify commitments because asylums paid fees for admitting patients. In Illinois, where Elizabeth Packard lived, the law allowed a husband to commit his wife by simply requesting commitment, providing a certificate signed by 2 doctors stating that the woman was insane and having her physically transported to the asylum. No hearing was required. No opportunity for the woman to defend herself or to present contrary evidence was provided. No investigation into whether the husband had ulterior motives was conducted. The asylum administration was required to accept any commitment that met these minimal paperwork requirements. And once a woman was inside the asylum, she became subject to the institution's complete control, with essentially no ability to communicate with the outside world or to challenge her confinement. The doctors who signed commitment certificates often conducted cursory examinations or no examination at all, relying entirely on the husband's description of his wife's behavior and accepting his characterization of that behavior as evidence of insanity. Elizabeth Packard's commitment in 1860 followed a pattern that was disturbingly common. A husband who was embarrassed or angered by his wife's behavior or opinions used the asylum system to silence her and to assert control. Elizabeth and Theophilus Packard had been married since 1839 and had 6 children together, and by most accounts, the marriage had functioned reasonably well until the late 1850s, when Elizabeth began expressing religious views that diverged from her husband's strict Calvinist beliefs. Elizabeth had become interested in spiritualism and in more liberal interpretations of Christian doctrine, views that Theophilus found heretical and that he believed reflected mental instability because he could not imagine that a rational woman would disagree with his theological positions. Elizabeth began attending Bible study groups and discussion meetings where she expressed her opinions, and Theophilus became increasingly concerned that her public disagreements with him were damaging his reputation as a minister and were undermining his authority in the household. He demanded that Elizabeth stop expressing her heterodox views and that she submit to his religious authority as the Bible commanded wives to submit to husbands. When Elizabeth refused to be silenced, Theophilus decided to have her committed. On June 18, 1860, Theophilus brought 2 doctors to the Packard home and had them certify that Elizabeth was insane based on his descriptions of her religious opinions and her refusal to submit to his authority. The doctors apparently did not conduct any meaningful examination of Elizabeth or ask her to explain her views or her reasons for holding them. They simply accepted Theophilus's characterization that any woman who would disagree with her husband about religion and who would persist in expressing those disagreements despite his commands to stop must be suffering from mental derangement. That same day, Elizabeth was forcibly removed from her home and transported to the Illinois State Hospital for the Insane in Jacksonville, where she would be confined for the next 3 years. Her children, who ranged from infants to teenagers, were told that their mother had gone insane and had to be locked away for everyone's safety. Elizabeth was given no opportunity to say goodbye or to explain what was happening or to arrange for anyone to investigate whether her commitment was justified. She simply disappeared from her home and community, locked away in an institution where the outside world could not hear her protests. The conditions Elizabeth experienced at the Illinois State Hospital were typical of asylum confinement in the mid-19th century, which combined genuine medical treatment for patients who were actually mentally ill with custodial care for people who had been committed for non-medical reasons, but who could not prove their sanity or secure release. Elizabeth was housed with women suffering from various mental illnesses and was subjected to the asylum's routine, which included forced sedation, isolation in locked rooms for infractions of asylum rules, and limited contact with anyone outside the institution. She was forbidden from writing letters without approval from asylum officials, who censored any correspondence that criticized the commitment or that asked for help. She was not allowed visitors unless those visitors were approved by Theophilus, which meant that Elizabeth had no way to communicate with people who might believe her claims of wrongful commitment and who might help her secure release. The asylum superintendent, Dr. Andrew McFarland, initially believed that Elizabeth was genuinely disturbed because he trusted Theophilus's characterization and because he found Elizabeth's insistence on expressing her religious opinions and her refusal to accept her husband's authority as evidence of inappropriate behavior for a woman. But over the months and years that Elizabeth was confined, McFarland gradually came to recognize that she was not insane, and that she had been committed because of a family dispute rather than because of genuine mental illness. Elizabeth's response to her confinement demonstrated the catch-22 that trapped wrongfully committed women. If she accepted the commitment and behaved submissively, acknowledging that she had been wrong to disagree with her husband and promising to submit to his authority in the future, she might be released, but only on condition that she return to her husband's control and abandon the independence and the opinions that had led to her commitment in the first place. If she insisted on her sanity and her right to hold opinions independent of her husband, asylum officials interpreted this insistence as evidence of continued mental disturbance because a truly sane and properly feminine Woman would defer to her husband's judgment and would recognize that her confinement was for her own good. Elizabeth chose to insist on her sanity and her rights, and she spent her 3 years of confinement documenting the conditions in the asylum, writing detailed accounts of her experiences and of other women's experiences, and maintaining her intellectual engagement and her sense of self despite all attempts to break her will and make her submit. She smuggled out letters to sympathetic visitors. She formed alliances with other wrongfully committed women, and she carefully preserved her writings that would eventually be published and would expose the asylum system's abuses. The legal battle for Elizabeth's release began in 1863, when Illinois law changed to require jury trials for asylum commitments, partly in response to growing public awareness that asylums were being used to confine sane people for non-medical reasons. Under the new law, anyone confined in an asylum could request a jury trial to determine their sanity, and Theophilus could not prevent such a trial from occurring once Elizabeth formally requested one. The trial took place in January 1864 and became a public spectacle as Elizabeth testified about her commitment, about the religious disagreements that had motivated it, and about her experiences in the asylum. Theophilus and the doctors who had signed the commitment certificate testified that Elizabeth's refusal to submit to her husband's religious authority and her persistence in expressing heterodox opinions constituted evidence of insanity. Asylum staff testified about Elizabeth's behavior during confinement, with some supporting her claim of sanity and others suggesting she remained disturbed. After several days of testimony and deliberation, the jury found Elizabeth sane and ordered her release, a verdict that was both a personal victory for Elizabeth and a public embarrassment for Theophilus and for the asylum system that had kept her confined for over 3 years based on such flimsy justification. But Elizabeth's victory in court did not immediately solve her problems, because she was still legally married to Theophilus and still subject to coverture laws that gave him control over her property, her earnings, and her children. When she returned to the Packard home after her release, Theophilus initially allowed her to stay but maintained strict control over her activities and insisted that she submit to his authority. When Elizabeth continued to express her opinions and to work on publishing her writings about asylum abuse, Theophilus responded by locking her in her room and boarding up the windows, essentially imprisoning her in her own home. Neighbors eventually helped Elizabeth escape from this confinement, but she had to leave her children behind because she had no legal custody rights and because Theophilus could have her arrested for kidnapping if she tried to take them. Elizabeth spent the next several years fighting for custody of her children through legal means while also campaigning for reform of commitment laws and for married women's property rights that would prevent husbands from having absolute control over their wives. Elizabeth's campaign for legal reform was driven by recognition that her case was not unique and that thousands of women had been wrongfully committed to asylums by husbands who wanted to silence them, to steal their property, or to clear the way for remarriage or other arrangements that required removing inconvenient wives. Elizabeth traveled throughout the United States, giving speeches about asylum abuse and about married women's lack of legal rights. She published multiple books, including Modern Persecution or Insane Asylums Unveiled, which documented her own experiences and those of other women she had met in the asylum. She lobbied state legislatures to reform commitment laws and to establish procedural protections that would prevent wrongful commitments. And she gathered testimony from other women who had been committed by husbands, creating a body of evidence that demonstrated systematic abuse of the asylum system and that forced lawmakers to acknowledge that reforms were necessary. The reforms that Elizabeth advocated for and that were gradually adopted in various states during the 1860s and 1870s included requirements for jury trials before commitment, prohibitions on husbands committing wives without independent medical examination and legal proceedings, establishment of visiting committees that would inspect asylums and investigate complaints of wrongful confinement, and changes to married women's property laws that would give wives some legal standing independent of their husbands. These reforms did not immediately end wrongful commitments or completely eliminate husbands' power over wives, but they did establish that wives had some rights that husbands could not simply override, and that commitment to an asylum required more than just a husband's say-so, backed by complicit doctors. The reforms represented recognition that the absolute authority coverture gave husbands was being systematically abused, and that some limits on that authority were necessary to protect women from being disappeared into asylums without cause. The broader context of how asylum commitment was used as a tool of control over women extended beyond husbands committing wives to include parents committing adult daughters, adult children committing aging parents, and other family members using commitment as a way to resolve property disputes or to eliminate people whose behavior or opinions were considered inappropriate or embarrassing. Women were particularly vulnerable to wrongful commitment because gender norms of the 19th century defined appropriate feminine behavior very narrowly, and women who were too independent, too opinionated, too ambitious, or too unwilling to submit to male authority could be characterized as mentally disturbed simply for violating these gender expectations. Behaviors that would have been considered normal or even admirable in men, assertiveness, intellectual curiosity, financial independence, unconventional opinions, were interpreted as evidence of mental instability when exhibited by women because they conflicted with ideals of feminine submission and domesticity. This meant that asylums became dumping grounds for women who challenged patriarchal norms or who were inconvenient to male relatives who wanted control over property or decisions. The financial incentives that made asylum abuse possible and profitable involved multiple parties who benefited from wrongful commitments. Asylums received payment for each patient they admitted and for each day patients remained confined, creating incentives to accept questionable commitments and to resist releasing patients. Doctors who signed commitment certificates received fees for their services, creating incentives to accommodate requests for certificates without conducting thorough examinations. Husbands who committed wives could gain control over wives' property and inheritance, could avoid having to support wives financially, and could remarry or form new relationships without the complications of divorce. Lawyers and other professionals who facilitated commitments received fees for their services. This web of financial incentives meant that wrongful commitment was not just a matter of individual abusers exploiting their wives, but was a systematic practice that multiple institutions and professions participated in and profited from. Reforming this system required not just changing laws, but also creating oversight mechanisms and accountability measures that would prevent financial interests from overriding proper medical and legal standards. The medical understanding of mental illness in the mid-19th century was primitive by modern standards and was heavily influenced by social prejudices about class, gender, and race that allowed normal behaviors and opinions to be pathologized when they conflicted with social norms. Doctors who worked with asylum patients genuinely believed that women who rejected domesticity, or who insisted on intellectual independence, or who expressed unconventional religious or political opinions, were suffering from mental disorders that required confinement and treatment. This was not necessarily cynical fraud, but was the product of a medical paradigm that did not distinguish clearly between mental illness as a medical condition and social deviance as a violation of norms. The result was that asylum physicians could sincerely believe they were helping women like Elizabeth Packard by confining them and trying to cure them of their inappropriate ambitions and opinions, while those women understood perfectly well that they were being punished and silenced for challenging male authority. This disconnect between how asylum officials understood what they were doing and how committed women experienced confinement made reform difficult, because officials believed they were practicing legitimate medicine rather than participating in social control. The parallels between wrongful asylum commitment and domestic violence. As systems of control over women are striking and important for understanding how patriarchal power functioned in the 19th century. Both asylum commitment and domestic violence involved men using force and intimidation to control women's behavior and to punish women who challenged male authority. Both were legally sanctioned, or at least were not effectively prohibited by law that gave husbands broad authority over wives. Both were enabled by social norms that portrayed male authority over women as natural and proper, and that blamed women who resisted such authority for bringing punishment upon themselves. And both were maintained partly through isolation of victims who were prevented from communicating with outsiders who might help them escape. The difference was that asylum commitment involved institutionalizing violence and control by using medical authority and state power to confine women, whereas domestic violence was private and occurred within households. But both served similar functions of enforcing women's subordination and of punishing women who stepped outside narrowly defined gender roles. The recovery of women's stories about wrongful asylum commitment has been an ongoing historical project because asylum records were often incomplete or were destroyed, because women who were released often did not publish their experiences out of fear of social stigma, and because even when women did speak about their experiences, their accounts were often dismissed as unreliable testimony from people who must have been at least partially disturbed, or they would not have been committed. Elizabeth Packard's case became well known because she was an effective advocate and because she published extensive documentation. But historians have identified hundreds of other cases where women were committed for reasons that had nothing to do with genuine mental illness and everything to do with family conflicts, property disputes, or punishment for violating gender norms. These cases came to light through examination of asylum records that survived, through reading between the lines of commitment certificates that revealed dubious justifications, and through studying women's reform movements of the 19th century that documented asylum abuse as part of broader campaigns for women's rights. The pattern that emerges is that wrongful commitment was common enough to be a realistic fear for women who challenged male authority or who inherited property that male relatives wanted to control, and that the legal system provided minimal protection against such abuse. Elizabeth Packard's later life demonstrated both the progress that could be achieved through determined advocacy and the limits of what one person could accomplish against systematic injustice. After securing her release from the asylum, and after years of legal battles with Theophilus, Elizabeth eventually gained legal separation and custody of her younger children, though she never succeeded in changing the fundamental inequalities of marriage law during her lifetime. She continued publishing and speaking about asylum reform and women's rights through the 1870s and 1880s, helping to inspire reforms in multiple states and contributing to the broader women's rights movement that would eventually secure married women's property rights and other legal protections. Elizabeth died in 1897 at age 80, having lived long enough to see substantial progress in the areas she had fought for, but also having witnessed how slowly institutions changed and how resistant legal systems were to granting women genuine equality. Her legacy included the specific law reforms she inspired and the broader contribution to public awareness that women needed legal rights independent of their husbands, and that marriage should not be a legal prison from which women could not escape. The question of how the law could have given husbands such absolute power over wives, and how society could have tolerated systematic abuse of asylum commitment, requires understanding the ideologies and assumptions that structured 19th century thought about gender, family, and authority. The legal doctrine of coverture was based on the belief that social order required clear hierarchies with men holding authority over women, that families functioned best when husbands had unquestioned power to make decisions, and that women's subordination to male authority was natural and divinely ordained. These beliefs were reinforced by religious teachings that emphasized wives' duty to submit to husbands, by philosophical arguments claiming that women were intellectually and emotionally inferior to men and thus needed male guidance, and by economic structures that made it difficult for women to support themselves outside marriage. The asylum system's abuse was enabled by medical ideologies that pathologized women's independence and by institutional interests in maintaining patient populations and revenues. Challenging these structures required attacking the fundamental assumptions about gender and authority that they were built upon, which was why reform was so difficult and why it required decades of sustained activism by women's rights advocates. The modern relevance of Elizabeth Packard's story and of the broader history of wrongful asylum commitment extends to ongoing struggles over women's autonomy, bodily integrity, and legal rights. While husbands can no longer commit wives to asylums without due process, and while married women now have property rights and legal standing independent of their husbands, the underlying issue of men using institutional power to control women persists in various forms. Debates over reproductive rights, over domestic violence law and enforcement, over economic inequality that leaves women vulnerable to abuse they cannot afford to escape, and over medical treatment of women whose symptoms are dismissed or whose testimony about their own bodies is not believed, all echo the dynamics that made wrongful commitment possible. Elizabeth's story reminds us that legal rights that seem fundamental today had to be fought for against fierce resistance, that those rights are not automatically secure and can be eroded if vigilance is not maintained, and that institutional power can still be used to control and silence women who challenge authority or who assert autonomy that patriarchal structures find threatening. What should we remember about Elizabeth Packard and about the thousands of other women who were wrongfully committed to asylums by husbands, who had absolute legal power to imprison their wives without cause? That coverture law made married women legally incompetent and subject to their husbands' complete control, including control over property, earnings, children, and physical liberty. That asylum commitment laws allowed husbands to have wives locked away simply by claiming insanity and by getting two complicit doctors to sign certificates, with no requirement for trials or opportunities for wives to defend themselves. That thousands of women were committed not because they were mentally ill, but because they disagreed with husbands, inherited property that husbands wanted to control, embarrassed husbands with their opinions or behavior, or simply inconvenienced husbands who wanted them gone. That Elizabeth spent 3 years locked in an asylum, not because she was insane, but because she expressed religious opinions her minister husband found heretical and threatening to his authority. That she successfully fought for release through jury trial, exposing her wrongful commitment and embarrassing the asylum system. That she spent years campaigning for legal reforms that would protect other women from the abuse she had suffered. That those reforms were gradually adopted and did establish basic rights for married women, though full legal equality was not achieved during her lifetime. And that her story represents countless other women whose wrongful commitments were never challenged and who disappeared into asylums, never to be heard from again. What do you think about laws that gave husbands absolute power to commit wives to asylums without due process or opportunity for defense? How should we judge a society that tolerated and legally sanctioned such systematic abuse as normal exercise of marital authority? Do you think modern legal protections against such abuse are adequate, or do you see echoes of the same patriarchal control in contemporary institutions? And what responsibility do we have to remember women like Elizabeth Packard, who fought against unjust laws and whose advocacy created rights we now take for granted? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If Elizabeth's story of being locked in an asylum for disagreeing with her husband and her successful fight for release and for legal reform challenged how you think about marriage law and women's rights in the 19th century, hit that subscribe button for Epoch of Fear and smash the notification bell. We expose the legal horrors that trapped women for centuries. and we honor the advocates who fought for reforms that established basic human rights. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that married women were not legally persons, independent of their husbands until remarkably recently, and that rights like owning property, controlling earnings, and not being committed to asylums without cause had to be won through decades of activism. Your husband could have you committed. He could take everything you owned. This was normal and legal. Elizabeth Packard said no and changed history. Remember her.